This week we've got Eric Ries. Eric and I crossed paths way before his book, but in between, the publishing of his initial blog post called The Lean Startup, which is a very short blog post. To go back and read it, it's only a couple of paragraphs, but the impact that those few paragraphs had on startup culture at that time were, per word, might be some of the most impact ever. And interestingly, he published them anonymously. He wasn't a personal brand at that time, but he had these ideas he wanted to get out into the world, and they had an immediate impact. I mean, between the time from publishing that to being sucked on to the speaker tour and going from kind of hero and advocate of these ideas to villainized by funds and investors as advocating for shoddy products was incredibly quick. But that impact was huge. I just wanted to sit back down with him and catch up on a bunch of things. He's been in my life for a long time, someone who's had a big impact on me from the very formative ideas of indie to now. He's someone I respected tons. So we decided to head up north, decamp to his backyard, and have a conversation that ranged from founder mental health crisis to long-term thinking and how to embed that in the governance of companies, and so many more things in between. It was just great to get his updated ideas. He's just such an original thinker. Hope you enjoyed this conversation with Eric Ries.
Almost always there's something unusual to the story if you can find it, and then you can make the episode about that. And I think what's really interesting is most of those people are in a total defensive crouch about it all the time.
Fascinating. What do you mean?
They're like, well, we didn't really do it the normal way, but it worked out for us. It's okay. Yeah.
But they're coming at it not from a position of optimism and strength. It's apologetically.
And even if you're like, do you think other people should do it? They're like, well, I don't know. It worked for us, but everyone says it was a bad idea. So maybe it's not like they're actually not so secure that the model that they followed is replicable by other people, which I think is really fascinating. So every founder I know is stuck in this rut of there's only one way. I have to do everything by the book. And then if you're like, well, actually, you don't have to. They're like, who's ever done it? They're so defensive. Who's ever done it? I'll be like, this person. They're like, those people didn't do what you're saying. And I'm like, that's why I started doing the bio. I was like, well, let me get them on camera and have them tell you the story.
Who were your canonical ones when they would say, who's done it? Were there a handful that came to mind for you?
Honestly, not really. Okay. Because most people are famous for having done one odd thing.
Yeah.
The one weird trick. And my whole thesis is we should, if there's all these good things that are good in isolation, they'd be even better together. So why don't we just build a whole new model? Which is that's how I got into Lean Startup in the first place. So but as a result, there's not one company where I can say this company's doing everything right. And I kind of feel like if I did hold somebody like that up, people would go nitpick that story and make it all about, is that company good or bad? And it's no, think for yourself. I'm trying to give you permission to do things you already want to do. I'm not trying to tell you to do anything.
Eric.
Yeah.
Are you telling people to go into founder mode?
I'm not. Okay. I'm not telling people to do that because the reason they have to go into what I love about the founder mode story, every one of those guys who's told those stories, is they're always like, I had to cut through all the bureaucracy and the red tape and the this and the dumb people. And I'm like, who hired those people? Who set up those systems that you're having to cut through? How about, it's great. I'm glad that you're doing that. That's better than not doing it. But then I've been around some of those guys long enough to have to watch them go through that cycle multiple times. They cut through all the stuff, they get to the solution, they start building the craft back up. And it's how about we just run the company in a sustainable way in the first place? We won't need founder mode.
What's behind building it back up again? If they already learned the lesson that didn't work.
Because what's the lesson? That's the question of what did they learn? Yeah. And the name is right in founder mode. The lesson they learned is that they're special and that they have all the answers and they have to micromanage and whatever. And you can scale that to exactly as much as you can handle as an individual person. And that's why are we having a mental health crisis? Why are these guys going crazy? If it's all about you and you're the besieged, one founder described it to me as, it's I feel like I'm a vampire. I live forever. And everybody else just comes and goes.
Oh, that's so...
And it's it's an extremely isolating way to live.
Yeah.
And to run your company and to feel like nobody else really gets it but you. And you get excited about the next big thing, the next person, this person gets it, and then you watch as they sort of don't get it, and then you have to fire them, and they have to replace them with another person, and I was really surprised to hear someone describe themselves that way to me.
Right.
Not that they were proud of it, but there was a moment of real vulnerability. It's that's actually how I feel. Anyway, we should do the show.
We are doing the show. This is literally it.
And I didn't name any names. Let me tell you who's really an asshole.
Yeah, exactly. Is there a pattern you see with the vampire founders out there?
There's actually two things that are being sucked into one. One is the recognition that these companies are immortal. They're alive. Like they live on beyond the human lifespan, and they are like real organisms in the same way that they're as alive as we are.
Totally.
But then secondly, founders are taught to conflate the company with themselves. It's like an ego identification thing. So if you think you are the company and the company is like has this immortal quality to it, then you start to feel like you're immortal. At first that sounds great. You're like, oh, my legacy will live forever. But like in real life, being immortal is quite scary, as fiction has explored many times. Yep. And you have this feeling of people coming and going. I really think that was what it was. That like, when you've been working on a company for 5, 10, 15 years, in the traditional model especially, what percentage of employees stay even 3 years, right? You have a few people that have been with you a long time, but generally speaking, people burn out. Generally speaking, you have to fire them. Like there's people who are great at the early stage, but now they're not great here, and we're not very good at reincorporating those talents into later phases. So we tend to go through these phases of like, this is the team, and these are the greatest people since sliced bread, and then now we have to make a pivot, I have to make a change, now we have to get to the next level, fire all those people, get better people. And there's a reality to it. As you get more successful, you're also going to hire better people, higher paid people, people with more expertise in the thing that you want. And you start to look down on the people you had before as like, those are the people I could get. Now I can get this guy. And then like, I can't tell you how many times I've been through this cycle of like, you get rid of all the old timers are gone, they're gone. These new highly credentialed guy comes in, and then like, sometimes it's months later, years later, I mean, I see people be like, he never really did anything. He was really credentialed, he talked a good game, but now I got to get rid of them. So I've learned my lesson, I got to bring in the next guy. And it's just like, you have this feeling you stay, but everyone else around you goes.
Yeah.
And it's a very isolating, very painful way to live.
Is it endemic to the Silicon Valley model for building companies, or do you see this across categories? Because I know you work with companies in tech, outside of tech.
I think there is something to the founder CEO being in this situation more than a more caretaker CEO. These institutions that have been through multiple successions, yeah, people still say it's lonely at the top, but there's still much more of an idea that like the company is a team, the company is a family, the company is like people talk about like a machine, that has to be nurtured and oiled. And so I think there's more of a sense of community there for the leaders, at least, than there is. I think the founder CEO has like, especially in the way we've taught people to do it, it's a uniquely lonely experience.
Is there anything to the vampire metaphor that is almost valueless? Or, I don't know, when I think of a vampire, I think of someone who kind of acts without feeling. Mm-hmm. They know what they have to do to survive and to win, and they do that with not blatant disregard, because I don't even think that suggests that there was some
regard in the first place, yeah. Yeah, no, I do think there's an amoral dimension to it. I think what people don't understand about these, personality disorders really, is that they're also superpowers. Part of what makes such a person effective, if you look at the literature on like neurodivergence, we see a lot of that in founders because they see the world differently than other people. And that can be a huge strength, or it can be a huge liability, and oftentimes a mix of both. And in the academic literature that study founders, one of my favorite studies, I read this years ago, they look at the personality traits that make you more likely to become a founder in the first place, and then they look at the ones that are correlated with success as a founder. And they all have these great academic euphemism names for them. Like one of them was like ability to ignore inconvenient facts and stuff like that. And
that's amazing.
All the correlations are reversed. So ability to ignore inconvenient facts makes you much more likely to become a founder, but then becomes much less likely to be successful. And I can't remember the other ones. There was a whole bunch of them. They'd say
if only somebody would have written a book for that founder to help them get to ground truth.
Well, I did my best. But what I think is so interesting about it is, as long as our focus is on the founder individually as a person, then we're encouraging that conflation that I am my company, and we're bringing all this like ego stuff to it. The best leaders, I think, have the kind of more servant leader mentality, and they understand that they're like stewards. They have a stewardship relationship, a parenting relationship to this organism that they are the leader of. They don't own it, they don't control it, they don't try to squeeze it for all it's worth. They're trying to build it like a gardener, or they have a more of an ecosystem view. And I feel like we don't have good language for this because it sounds so squishy. There's like one side is
do we not have good language, or do we just have so much convention built up around the way we talk about startups that we refuse to adopt any new language at all?
I thought you were going to say we have gender stereotypes because like, because it's like, wait a minute, if I'm being a caretaker or a gardener or that doesn't, I want to be hardcore. It doesn't sound hardcore.
It's certainly not hardcore.
Well, except, first of all, you've ever met a hardcore gardener?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, exactly. I disagree.
Yeah.
But the thing I think is really interesting, the people I admire the most, the companies I really have come to learn a lot from, are actually like ruthlessly difficult to compete with because they love their customers and they treat them well. And I used to really, I really bought into the idea that capitalism is about efficiency, competition. Ruthlessness means like exploitative as possible. If you don't exploit, someone else will exploit better than you and they'll undercut you on price or whatever. That's not been my experience. The companies that do that, I feel like every time a big company does something exploitative, some startup somewhere is high-fiving. Like, great, you just created a competitive opportunity. Exploitation is weakness, not strength.
Right.
Something you do out of desperation, not because you know what you're doing. There's this vast literature. Like, there's people who study this. And companies that are trustworthy are more valuable. Companies that invest in their people are more valuable. There's like all these things that it's like well known. And what I think is really fascinating is when I talk to founders now, I'm not going to try to convince you to do anything you don't want to do. But if you already want to do some of the things that I'm talking about, you have permission. And they're always like, I don't know. My lawyer said I can't do it. My investors, people, I've been told I can't do it. And I'll be like, look at this other company, they're doing it. Like, yeah, but they're special. I'm not special enough to do that. So people have this like feeling that it's not for them. It's always out of reach. Or they'll tell me, well, this sounds great, but it's so complicated. Or like, gosh, you have to solve this problem and this problem and this problem. It just seems insoluble. And a lot of people are in despair now about the state of the world. They feel like our society can't be fixed, capitalism can't be fixed. Like there's this real feeling of helplessness. And what I find so strange, earlier in my career, basically just made a list of those problems. I'm like, I wonder what the solution to every one of these problems is. Like, let me go find out. Because I was trying to build, the long-term stock exchange, and that required this really comprehensive understanding of how the system works and how it could be reformed. And I thought it was going to be really hard, and it's not. Almost every problem that people complain about, there's someone who studies that problem for a living and knows the answer. And I thought, okay, then the problem is going to be, I'll have to go build up new examples to show that this is possible, but they already exist. It's actually an open secret. Everybody somehow already knows what we need to do, but people have been told it's not for you. You can't have it. And so, I don't know, I feel weirdly optimistic. And sometimes people, I think, even feel like I'm being a little bit Pollyanna-ish, to be like, our problems are solvable. But I don't think that should be some kind of like radical statement. I feel like it's actually relatively straightforward. We do know what we need to do, and we have to, as other generations have had to do, we have to summon the courage to actually do it.
What was at the top of your problems list to solve?
Take your pick. I think, first of all, this like general question about whether companies are inevitably going to be exploitative or not is really important. This question of whether trustworthiness is actually an asset or not. Because I think that people kind of come into this, we all know we're complicit in a system that does a lot of bad stuff. And the funny thing is that our most ardent defenders of the system and its biggest critics agree on one thing, which is that the way it is inevitable. Profits over people is just the way it is. And some people are like, therefore the system has to be torn down. And other people are like, therefore, like, look at all the good the system does. You have to endure these consequences. It's just too bad for you. It's, look at the improvements we've had in child mortality. Look at the improvements we've had in, in nutrition and in science and vaccines and all the good stuff. You have to accept the negative downsides. That always seems strange to me because people act as if our morality is in conflict with business success. But I don't see the evidence that that's true. If it was true, I like to think I would still make the moral choice. And I think we should, but it isn't.
I have young professionals, kids who are finishing college, going out into the world.
Sure.
I see a lot of them in this generation that they don't relate to entrepreneurship in the same way that maybe our generation, like they don't see themselves as founders. They look at the archetypes that have been lionized and have a hard time placing themselves in a similar situation.
We ossify into conventional wisdom so quickly. Yeah. It's hard to remember how quickly it can change. I can remember when Mark Zuckerberg didn't look the part of an entrepreneur and couldn't get funded. That wasn't that long ago. And like now we make movies about it. And now, of course, everyone wants to be Mark Zuckerberg. These things go in fads and cycles, and that happens. The other thing I noticed is I talk to people my age and older about Gen Z. Most people who are professionals of any kind are complaining about Gen Z. They don't work hard. They won't come into the office. They think their work is like a privilege. Get them to do anything, and I should be so grateful that they came into the office. And why won't they come? I was talking to a law firm, and they were like, we can't get the young associates to come into the office. And they're like, but that's how we all got the mentorship we needed to climb the ladder to become where we are. And I'm like sitting there being like, maybe your mentorship's not that valuable. Like, they don't seem to think so. Maybe it was only
They've got
idiosyncratically
ChatGPT now.
Well, it's like you needed that mentorship in order to climb the ladder of your distinct organization. But Gen Z doesn't have reverence for institutions in general because institutions have let them down. Our institutions have grown weak and feeble in our generation, certainly. People watch it happen. The only exception to this rule is people who work at really mission-driven companies who are always like, I don't know why people complain about Gen Z. They work really hard. They're super passionate. I can't get them out of the office. And it's like, well, do you think it's a punchline that your work should change the world for the better? Or do you think that's for real? And most people are like, no one really believes that, right? It's like, no, the younger generation, they do believe it. So I think as we start to see the archetypes of new entrepreneurs have success with this different way of building companies, I think you'll see people rally to that more.
Do you think Silicon Valley still believes that?
I think a lot of people do. I know. So here's the thing that's strange about. Now, I shouldn't speak for Silicon Valley. I've been here a long time, but it's a complicated place. The loudest voices really don't speak for the Valley at large. Like that's really that's the really interesting thing. So I meet with founders basically every day, almost every day of my life. Someone calls me who's trying to start a company. It's the most common conversation I get. In general, I think there's been this recognition that as technology is growing more powerful, technology is like a little bit more dangerous than we used to think of it. I feel like in the early days of the internet and SaaS, we didn't see the danger of it. We only saw the excitement of it. And now founders are a little bit more sober. I think AI has had a lot to do with that. It's so manifestly frightening to the public that people have had a thought of like, how should this be set up? Anyway, I get this call all the time. And the vast majority of founders that I talk to still, even now, are very idealistic. They really think that what they're doing is going to matter and make the world a better place. And when I press them on this point, do you see what's happened to previous generations of founders and do you want that for themselves? They are much less likely than we were in the past to be super excited to follow in those other people's footsteps. Like they really see the mixed legacy of some of these, especially social media generation founders, when social media has become such a controversial thing. A lot of AI founders have said to me, I don't want to see AI be a redux of what happened with social media. That would be really bad. You talk to VCs, you talk to more successful people, you talk to older people, it's a mixed bag. But if you talk to founders, people who are starting a company right now, they are still almost unerringly idealistic. I have learned now over many years, I've been working on how do I help those people take what's in their heart and really do it. Not get talked out of it by their lawyer, not get talked out of it by their banker, not get talked out of it by their VC or anybody else. And I've now had the experience multiple times of people breaking down in tears while I'm talking to them about corporate governance. And people are like, how can that be? Corporate governance is the most boring topic in the world. But if you actually care about making the world a better place, then it's very meaningful. And I've had quite a few people tell me that no one else will even talk to them about that. They feel like no one even wants to make the effort to try to create something good. We've all just resigned ourselves to the idea that it's going to be bad. And I think that's really interesting because I know for sure if we don't try, we won't succeed.
Is there a part of your education of them on corporate governance that seems to elicit the wildest reaction, whether it's tears or gasps or...
The argument goes like this. First thing is, I think we have defined profit incorrectly. So we think we know what it means to be a for-profit company, but we're just wrong. And so our categories of kinds of companies that we start, like the start of the taxonomy begins with for-profit versus nonprofit. And we've already made a mistake. And a lot of our problems stem from this basic misunderstanding. To me, what it means to make a profit is to maximize human flourishing in the world. And that's not so different than the old definition, because the maximization is very important. It's still an optimization, efficiency, the good use of resources. But I think we have to recognize that the moral basis of capitalism is it leaves people better off in aggregate. And as soon as you accept that premise, I think you've accepted the whole system of the argument that I'm about to tell you, because I have this argument all the time with people. What is the moral basis of capitalism? They always say voluntary exchange, surplus value, always ends up in human flourishing. And they're like, great, but what about activities that are guaranteed to diminish human flourishing? Are they part of the moral? And that people are like, well, you kind of got to accept that. But why? Well, we can't know. People retreat instantly to we can't really know who's to regulate, who's to say. And it's like, look, I get policy is complicated, politics is complicated, who should regulate is all complicated. But before we get to any of those questions, first question is, what should we as entrepreneurs want to do? I'm not talking about what we're allowed to do. We've accepted this premise that entrepreneurs will generally do whatever they can get away with. But not the people I know, not when they start out. People start out with a real sense of integrity and morality about what they're trying to do. And they genuinely believe, diluted though they may be, that this thing is going to make the world a better place. Once you accept that that is what the purpose of being a for-profit company is, then you can start to differentiate between different ways of making money. They're not all the same. I would say the Smithsonian, although it is a nonprofit, is a very profitable institution. First of all, it makes a ton of money and also leaves the world so much better off. And I would say that Philip Morris, they're just selling people poison for money.
Yeah.
Why? Why is that good? We get a certain amount of clarity when we say, okay, that's what it means to be a for-profit. But then people say, okay, but then how could I embody that in my organization's ethos? And then we get to that problem we were talking about before, which is people don't understand what their organization is. They think it's just an org chart on a piece of paper, but it's not. It's a living superorganism. And it has its own moral compass and its own sense of purpose. And just like individuals can exist in a flow state, organizations can exist in a flow state. And some of us have worked in those places. I mean, I tell you, a million people I meet are like, that one time in that one place, that one organization, I just felt this incredible rush of like alignment. Everything felt aligned.
That's amazing.
It's a great feeling. It's all too rare, but it's what people want. And I was just joking with someone who was asking me for advice today, literally this morning. I was like, look, if that, they were agreeing with me that basically that experience is what everybody wants. I'm like, if that's what the people want, how many companies are complaining that they can't find talent? People aren't loyal, they don't stay, having trouble, hiring or retaining them. I'm like, why don't you give the people what they want? The solutions are all known. We know what people want in a workplace. Why don't you try giving it to them? Right. The people that are doing that, they don't have workplace retention problems. They don't feel like vampires. All these issues that people find so difficult evaporate when you realize that the organism has its own destiny, its own sense of purpose, its own moral compass. So then people are like, well, if that's true, how can I align it around human flourishing or the thing that I want in my mission or purpose? It seems to me like organizations inevitably get sucked down into this mediocrity of our, degraded system we have now. If you draw a diagram of like, what is this thing? There's always a borderline, a border that mediates from the inside to the outside. And we need a term for that thing. That exoskeleton determines how strong or weak an institution is. And we should try to build institutionally strong organization. And there's actually a discipline for studying that thing. It's called governance. Mm-hmm. It's boring as hell. But it's really important. And for most founders, I can't tell you how many people who have an already operating incorporated company, sometimes with significant employees and revenues, I'm the first person that has ever talked to them about governance.
Because in all prior conversations, it's the stuff you don't need to pay attention to in the docs. This is all standard stuff.
Everything's standard. It's all standard. Don't worry about it. And people have been told that the way we do things, like kind of the standard Delaware C Corp with 2 investors, 2 founders, 1 independent on the board, like the whole package is both the only and best way, which is such a tell. Because how can it be both? Shouldn't it be one or the other? How can it be the only and the best? Well, I'm here to say I've done the research. It is not the only. There are actually a wide variety of governance structures out there, and it's definitely not the best. People study this thing for a living, have conclusively shown that this is like, it's okay, but we could do a lot better. That's the beginning of the conversation, is to say, look, what would a governance structure look like? How should a company be organized such that it has that feeling of flow, it is maximizing human flourishing, and people both want to be a customer of it, want to work there, want to invest in it. It's like a really aspirational thing. That's usually when founders start to get either like really excited or very emotional or very defensive. It's like, that seems like that's not for me. I'll never get that. I heard that so-and-so may have gotten that, but I can't have it. And when you
what are the kind of building blocks of even governance, if you think about it as component parts?
Yeah.
There's some mixing and matching that even you would consider doing.
You want to customize for the situation that you're in. Yeah. And I've become like an avant-garde collector of weird governance ideas over the years. Like I have this collection, and listen, before AI, people were not that interested, and all of a sudden people became super interested.
I bet.
Mission trust and all that stuff are in the news. So like a simple one, I'll just give you one example, just simplest one. I always ask founders to tell me who you think the most evil company in the world is. You don't have to tell me, it's okay, we're on camera. Whoever you think it is. I'm going to use Philip Morris because my father's a pulmonologist.
Yeah.
I was raised at Philip Morris, the most evil company in the world. But you could, something really specific to Philip Morris.
Yeah.
If you have a company and they come and try to buy you, and they say, listen, whatever your company's worth, I'll pay you $1 more per share than it's worth. Most founders will say, well, hold on, what do they want to use it for? I'm like, they're going to sell cigarettes to children. That's what they use it for. And they're like, well, I'm not selling. I'm like, oh, interesting. Let's go pull your Delaware charter. Let's go read it. It's a public document, actually. Any lawyer can pull it up. So take a look. Oh, look, it says here, according to most governance experts, you have a fiduciary duty, not just to consider this offer, but to accept it. And every founder reacts the same way. They're like, my lawyer would never have set me up like that. You must get it wrong. You're right. My buddy so-and-so, he's great. He told me I had the standard thing. I can worry about this stuff later. I'm like, what if Phil Morris comes tomorrow? And some of them will be like, I don't believe you. I'm like, that's fine. Call your lawyer. He has an ethical obligation to answer your questions honestly, and he'll answer this one the way I'm telling you. And I always get a second call. How? What do I do? Here's the crazy part. This is what I'm trying to say. This whole thesis. For every one of these problems, there's a simple solution. And like this one is the easiest one in the planet. It's like a 1-page filing in Delaware to amend your charter to say what your corporate purpose is. It's called being a public benefit corporation, PBC, not the B with the circle in it, that's different. And people are like, that can't be right. This massive problem cannot be solved, surely, with a 1-page filing. Here's the crazy part. Even after I get people through this whole thing and they're like, I'm gonna do that filing, Most people don't do the filing. Even after acknowledging that this is a real risk, even after acknowledging that the solution is very simple, even after talking to their own attorney, I often provide another attorney to give them a second opinion. They just don't get around to doing it because when they do call their attorney and say, I want to do this, and they call their investor or whoever, they're always like, you can always do that later. It's too early to worry about stuff like that. Don't worry about it. Investors might not like it. I'm always like, who? Which investors? And the system has gotten really good. People who are in this are become very skilled at telling founders what they need to hear to keep them on the standard path. So too early, don't worry about it. You're so smart. This won't happen to you. Eric's a downer. If he knew how smart and brilliant you really were, he would realize it's not going to happen to you. I've been at this long enough that I've had this exact conversation with like multiple pre-IPO companies where the CEO's like, I don't need to worry about this, it's not going to happen to me. And those companies are gone. They don't exist anymore. I'm not trying to be Mr. Downer. I'm not trying to give you bad news. I'm trying to help you solve this problem. So like there's, again, the problem is not knowledge of the answer. The problem is not even what's in the heart. The question is like, can I overcome all of this institutional inertia to do things a standard way?
I mean, the biggest story of the year has been a corporate governance issue that seems to buck exactly what you're advocating for, right? Like they tried a creative structure. It caused nothing but headache and trouble. It seems to be the lesson that people are wanting to tease out of that experience. How do you reconcile that?
I'm not here to say that all alternative structures are good structures. I think there's a really interesting question, in the OpenAI case, whether they would have had the success that they've had if they'd been on the conventional structured path. So people have taken this automatic assumption that what happened is bad. Many of the people involved have taken a different lesson, which I think is really interesting. The first time OpenAI had this kind of drama, 3 dramas ago, I don't know how, depends on how you count, is when the Anthropic founders left to form Anthropic. That was also over a values disagreement with the CEO. And I met them. I didn't know what generative AI was at all. I met them at the time because one of their investors asked them to talk about governance with me. Because they're like, we want to try to solve some of the problems we saw at OpenAI, but also we don't want to just do the conventional thing, but we also got to raise, these AI companies consume incredible amounts of capital, so they have to raise all this money. So they wanted to raise, an unbelievable amount of money at the time, although now they're raising it $4 billion at a time. So it's obviously very different than then. They really were very thoughtful about it. And so, they wound up creating something called the long-term benefit trust.
Oh, fascinating. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, they did the filing I'm just describing. I had the exact same conversation I'm having with you about profit and it's like in my living room with them, when they were leaving OpenAI to start the company. And the difference in them and a lot of other founders I talked to is they actually did a lot of this stuff. It's really exciting. So they found a way to be a for-profit company in the conventional sense with this public benefit designation, but then also they have what the category thing is called the mission trust, the LTBT, which is our outside trustees who have special governance powers. So there are these alternative structures that I think are just basically more resilient and better than the standard way we do it, but not just because something's a deviation doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. And it also, I think I remember this from Lean Startup too, people want the one weird trick so badly. If I just do this one thing, I'm guaranteed to have success. And I remember people talk about Lean Startup, they, after been successful for a while, they'd be like, here's an example of someone who did something from Lean Startup and they didn't succeed. I'm like, well, here's a professional poker player that lost a hand. Here's a baseball player who struck out. Even the very best players in the world, they struck out. Like, we're talking about probabilities. We're trying to increase the probability of good things happening. And here's the thing that to me gives me the most sense of optimism that change is possible. The people who defend the status quo spend an inordinate amount of time and money trying to convince everybody who will listen that the way things are is inevitable. I spent a lot of time, I was a would-be reformer, especially in the early days of LTSE. I would meet with anybody who worked on Wall Street, anyone who was an investor in startups or anything else, anyone who knew anything about the financial system. I was so ignorant. And the vast majority of people I met with were like, this can't work because the way things are is inevitable. The system is perfect, efficient market hypothesis, whatever. And it took me years to realize that if they actually believed it was inevitable, they wouldn't waste so much time on that message. Because if it's inevitable, they would just sit back and watch me fail. Be like, I don't have to do a thing. So why do you have to ambush and sabotage and evangelize something that's inevitable? I think it actually reveals that the system is quite fragile and people who operate in it, they have an intuitive understanding that it has to be defended. Many of the problems we have now stem from the fact that financial systems exhibit a property I call gravity, the ability to influence people unconsciously from a distance. I've been through this. I've taken so many companies public. I've helped so many people do so many things. And what I notice is that as companies age, they get more similar. They lose their distinctiveness. And like if I show you a press release from even a recent vintage successful company, and I scratch out what name it is, and I ask you what company wrote this, you won't be able to guess. They're all the same. They put out these statements, everything's the same. Their logos and the branding's all converging on a very limited palette. It's just like they've become, I feel like they're being surgically deboned. They become less courageous. They stand for less. They're just weak. They're weak institutions. And it's sad. Like, I think it's genuinely sad to watch this happen. I know so many founders who have like experienced real heartache about it.
Yeah.
And they're doing their best, but why is that happening? If it was random chance, sometimes they would get stronger, sometimes they would get weaker. People look at capitalism and at free markets and they say, well, there's so many different kinds of investors with so many different values. If investors are in control of companies, surely you'd have random outcomes, because like sometimes this kind of investor will win, sometimes that kind of investor will win. So it's the very consistency of the effect that reveals that there is a force operating. And that just like has a very like gravity feeling to it. And so I spent a lot of time studying like, what is this gravity? How does it operate? And basically my conclusion is that whenever you have financial transactions always transmit values unconsciously, whether you want to or not. And the mechanism is actually very simple. It's because whenever there's a power imbalance or a resource imbalance between human beings, we just very naturally start to imagine, what do I have to do to get the resource? So the issue is actually not with VCs in particular. It's with the perception that founders have about what I have to do to get VC. Those perceptions are often very wrong, but they're very real. It's not really even that, like if you talk to most long-term investors, they think the way the stock market works is crazy. They're like, this is terrible. Why does everyone accuse investors of being the bad guys? If you talk to, founders, they'll be like, it's the investors. Investors say, it's the founders. It's this and that. There's this vast army of middlemen who intermediate all these transactions, who have a very particular set of values that they promulgate. And so if you are in alignment with those values, your career everything's a little smoother. You get hired in your next job a little easier. You get promoted a little bit easier. Maybe your company failed, but you get backed in your next company. It's like, he's a good guy. Very often, unfortunately, a guy. The fact that this financial system transmits these values, to me, implies the possibility of an equally powerful, or maybe even more powerful financial system that transmitted different values. And since the way that we're encouraging people to work is both more profitable, more effective, and closer to what's already in people's hearts, I kind of feel like we got some natural advantages. Like that's actually a much stronger, firmer basis to build a financial system on than exploitation and fraud and trickery and deceit and these things.
Is there more to say around what's in people's hearts or the closeness of this to people's hearts? Because I feel like when I listen to you talk, company building is such a refining process for the individual.
Yeah.
It is such a formative experience for a founder to try and will something into existence, and yet everyone wants a formula.
Yeah.
Like that
yeah,
do you know what I mean? Like that's the, I think there's that spiritual component of this, there's that heart component of this, however you want to frame it.
Yeah.
That for the most loved companies reflect something about the person that created it. And yet feels like that's the thing people most want to tamp down. To your point earlier, like take the names off the S1s, take the names off the logos, keep the palettes, keep everything else.
Yeah, make it lose its distinctiveness.
Yes.
And I think again, because people conflate the ego with the company, it's confusing because it does reflect oftentimes on the values and the beliefs and the spirit of the original person. But then how many CEOs do we know that are really frustrated with their company? I was talking to a founder just the other day. We were having dinner and he's just so frustrated. He's trying to get his team to like get into the modern era about something. He's got the vision for it. He's figured it out. I'm like, he's created this multi-billion-dollar company.
Yep.
He has unquestioned control over it. But I'm like, why so frustrated? I see this with founders all the time. People are like, I want to celebrate the fact that your insight that at the time everyone thought was crazy got us to this multi-billion-dollar outcome. But I don't want to then accept that your next insight might also be just as good. It's like, no, now I want to defend the thing we already have. Right. Why do you want to go do the next thing? And like, that's just not how it works. You gotta, if you believe. So it's like, why is it so frustrating? And it's like, who's in charge? It's like, if the investors don't like it, and the CEO doesn't like it, and the board is frustrated, and the managers don't like it, and the employees don't like it, and the customers don't like it, who's in charge? Yeah. Who made this decision? What's going on? And so there's just this other thing that organizations take on. And I think founders are very inattentive on the whole to curating that aspect of things. So to me, the critical question is, what creates alignment? That flow state is when everyone is aligned. Well, that requires a continuous attention to your governance, continuous attention to the connection between governance and operations. Today, most people consider governance and operations two distinct fields, but like obviously to me, they're two sides of the same coin. Right. So governance includes what suppliers have power over you. It includes what collective action might the employees take. It includes who has the formal power on the org chart. And obviously the OpenAI example was a great example where like on paper everything seemed one way, but in reality it was another. So like to me, a really critical question for every company is like, how do you make sure that your employees are acting in accordance with your own values? Most companies don't have a good answer to that question. It's not even part of their formal review process. Or they have a formal review process, but they allocate budget and do promotions using a different process.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that really makes this hard is, as the founder, the organization reflects your actual values, not what you profess your values to be, not what you even think your values are. And that's why entrepreneurship is, I've always thought, a journey of self-discovery. It is really like a spiritual undertaking. That's not a joke or a metaphor to me. It's the real thing. You have to become self-aware about that stuff, or it gets dark fast. You have to really confront, like, what is it that I'm making? And like, a lot of people think they're making a product. It's like, no, you're making an organization that makes a product. Well, what does it mean to make an organization? And to me, people who are like, I did the one weird trick. It's like if someone came to you, it's like, I'm going to get fit. I'm going to go on a great diet. I'm going to exercise. You're like, great, what have you done so far? And like, I had a really healthy meal yesterday, and I went to the gym today. It's like, that's not a plan. That's the one. That's good. I'm glad you did the one thing. Or like, I bought a really cool exercise equipment. It's like, well, that's great. And then people will be like, well, but you're not saying I can get fit without going to the gym. I'm like, no. It's good that you did the one thing, that's excellent, but I think it's much more effective to think of this as a lifetime practice or a discipline. You want to be physically fit as a person, you want to be emotionally, spiritually fit as a person. It requires work, and so true at the organizational level. And so I think the organizations have done a really good job of this. They review it periodically, and they look for the moments of tension between their stated intentions and what's actually happening. Brian Chesky calls this institutionalizing your intentions. Not just saying, oh, I have good intentions, so that's good enough, but like trying to figure out how do I build an apparatus that makes sure that this happens. I think it's a Howard Schultzism, the reservoir of trust, he called it.
Okay.
Every time you take an action as a company, you're either making a deposit or making a withdrawal from this like bank account of how trustworthy you are as an organization. And so what does it mean to make a deposit? When you do something that's in your customer's best interest at some cost to yourself, we saw this a lot during the pandemic, right? Who would actually stand by their customers and who were like, well, we're all screwed together, so you're screwed too, like too bad. Right. People have incredibly long memories for those things, but also like in small ways. If you ask for a refund, I go, how big of a hassle do you have to go through to get it? It's funny how many of these like governance things people encounter in their everyday lives, right? Like why the company you have a commercial relationship with, why are they so much more happy to put you on hold and solve your problem? Why does your sports team have bad ownership and they always make the wrong trades, right? And they always make the wrong calls? And
always.
Why do they drive you crazy? And like, why does American construction projects take so much longer? And why can't we build housing? And why can't this? I could go on and on. There's like so many of these little things that every time you experience that as a customer, you trust that company a little bit less. Or if they do the right thing, you trust them a little bit more. And so you have like a current account. It's not part of our standard accounting, but it should be. How trustworthy are you to all the different stakeholders you care about? And Howard Schultz gave this advice to an entrepreneur. I heard the second or third hand, so I don't know who to attribute what to. He said, look, you want to build a trustworthy company, it's really simple. Only make deposits, never make withdrawals. And everyone I tell this advice to is like, that's too hard. That's too hard. And I'm like, hold on, I'm not saying never make mistakes, but never make an intentional withdrawal. And if someone on your team makes an intentional withdrawal, treat that like a problem. And treat a problem when it's small. Don't wait till the problem gets huge. And then, like think about how many things like started off with one person like making one little tweak. I was talking to a company that sends, I forget the number now, 14 emails a day on average or something. They got like their promotional emails were out of control, and the customers were so pissed. You know what the kind of companies I'm talking about?
Absolutely.
They just can't stop emailing me, and you're like, why? So how did that happen? Did the company wake up one day and say, let's spam the crap out of our customers? No. What happened was some middle manager somewhere is trying to hit their OKR and realize if I just send this one extra email, I'll do a little bit better. And then another and another and another. And next thing you know, now if you cut that off at the first time someone sends an unnecessary email, you won't have a problem. By the time it becomes endemic, the reason why the 14 emails were so painful is not that customers were mad, although they were. The big problem is that every middle manager, now their OKRs, have this level of emailing baked into them. Yeah. So to cut back on the number of emails is now going to collapse the whole business model and all the plans and all the stuff. So we don't want that. So we want to solve those problems before they become an official part of our revenue forecast and our business plan. So it becomes more painful. So we have to like a pruning, an antibody like system that we build to make sure that we don't do that kind of thing. And when we do that, we build up trustworthiness. This is to the question you were asking before. People sometimes say, business is already so hard. Why are you trying to make it harder? Right? Like, now I only have to like make money and make my investors money, but now I also got to be nice to my employees, and I got to do this, and I got to do the culture bank, and it's just like, God, it's so hard. And I always say the same thing. I'm like, is it maybe the reason you experience business is so hard is that nobody you work with trusts you? Would it be like if they did, and they were like, they trust me? I'm like, well, weren't you just complaining to me the other day about how employee comms is impossible? Like, yeah. No matter how many times I tell my employees what our strategy is, they always do the wrong thing. So I have to tell them and repeat it. And one of the most common pieces of CEO advice you'll ever hear is repeat relentlessly, repeat. And behind that advice is this unbelievable frustration that people won't do what they're told. The only people I meet who do not have this frustration are people who run companies like we're talking about. Because if what you're asking people to do like makes sense to them, is like naturally aligned with what they would want to do anyway, it's easy.
Yeah.
Like it's easy for them to understand what you're saying, but it's also easy for them to apply it in practice. And exploitation is actually very unnatural and people do not like doing it. I have personally helped people make billions of dollars. I don't think it's an exaggeration. I think if I count up the successful people I've been, had some small part in their success, we're talking about many billions of dollars of money that they have made. And I don't begrudge them their success, their fame, their wealth. I don't have any resentment about it. I'm not jealous of it. I'm really happy for them. What pisses me off and what I do begrudge them is how miserable they are. Not everybody. I mean, some people are perfectly happy and well-adjusted, but quite a lot of people who've made quite a lot of money are really unhappy. What are we doing this for? Why? I mean,
what's the source of it from your standpoint? That unhappiness.
I mean,
because I think we've both come through this wave of people that we've been close to, investments that we've made, where people, ZERP was an amazing time that changed a lot of people's financial picture in our world. But I see the same thing.
Not to pick on Tony Hsieh, who I knew and admired immensely, but like what makes him unusual is that his tragedy played out in public in such a way. So it's like you can go read the stories about what his life was like. He sold Zappos to Amazon for $800 million and continued to run it for quite a long time afterwards. And what happened? He should have been really happy. And people say, well, he's just troubled. But like I was just a friend the other day, someone was telling me about a friend who sold their company for $300 million. I think they owned 60% of it. I mean, they never made more than $100 million personally and committed suicide 3 years later.
Wow.
And then, forget the suicide. We obviously have plenty of tech entrepreneurs who've been misbehaving and malfunctioning in public. You could just see the meltdown and the misery of it is, forget whether they're right or wrong or, whose side they're on or whatever, but just like they're so manifestly unhappy. I think a lot of it has to do with the compromises that we force people to make on the road to success. And part of it, I think, goes back to the misunderstanding of what an organization is. If you're a parent and someone says, look, would you like to sell your child for $100 million? Most parents, no matter what their financial circumstances, would be horrified at that suggestion. But like, how many people have sold their company? And they made a lot of money. And they were promised at the time that the acquirer was going to turn it into something great. And now it's gone. That's hard. That's actually very difficult to live with. I know quite a few people who took companies public and then were deposed by activist investors. That's like a super common thing. I mean, I've been at this long enough that I've like urged them to put protections in place to prevent that from happening and lost the battle to their bankers who were like, you don't have to worry about that. You're going to be fine. The protections expire. Well, one example, I think the guy was fired in 180 days after the things expired. It was just like that. These are people who've made investors billions of dollars. People always say, well, capitalism is just about making as much money as possible for your investors. But if that was true, this wouldn't be happening. It didn't make anybody any money. This is insane. So I feel like there's this like, and then of course you have the companies who have survived, but at great cost. This is where the vampire thing comes in, where companies that started out so idealistic have turned into something so grim. And some companies, some people involved in that are just really unable to admit it. Social media is complicit in genocide. It's had this really malign effect on journalism and on politics. And it's just had all these other negative side effects. Leaving aside whether that could have been avoided, whether it was inevitable, I mean, there's people who defend them saying, well, what could they have done better? Leaving all that aside, it's very painful to have the thing that you made turn evil. Google, we love to pick on Google. Google is actually a great company. But remember, don't be evil.
Backspace.
I watched it. I can remember how I felt, how lots of other people in tech felt when they went public and they did that manifesto.
It's incredible.
We just felt
and
so
they did
silly.
everything differently. They did everything by their own terms.
We're going to do everything different, and we're going to blaze a new path. And I'll never forget, I met a retired banker from one of the elite firms when I was working at LTSC. And he's like, oh, this again. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, yeah, every once in a while some tech, I won't repeat what he said, says they're going to reform the system and we have a playbook for this. So I'll let you know what we did for Google. I was like, okay, you're going to tell me? He's like, oh yeah, I want you to know.
Yeah.
I had a dinner. I got all the bankers together from all the different firms. I said, we can't allow this. We need to make sure that this IPO is perceived to be a failure so that nobody copies them. And we did it. And I was like, the Google IPO is a failure? I don't know, I don't have the data in front of me, but if you invested in the Google IPO and held till now, you did pretty well. He's like, yeah, but how many people copied the Google playbook?
Yeah, 0.
Nobody did.
Yeah.
That was the plan. As long the system can tolerate as many quirky one-offs as you want, but what is threatening is if people started to realize that these changes could be done systematically and become part of a trend. That we do not want. We will not allow. If you tried to run your finance department on the basis of your intentions, you'd be in prison in no time. We all know what it means to take something seriously at the corporate level. So all I'm saying is, why don't we just take the things we actually care about as seriously as we take that? It's not that much to ask, is it?
No, it's not, Eric.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for
saying so.
I mean, what's interesting, I mean, there's so much that is sticking with me in this conversation, but one phrase you used earlier, a term you used, was gravity. And you related in a way with the banker who you were feeling the sense of gravity around, here's how it's always been done, kid. Yeah, you can get away with it one time, not multiple times. I remember when the Lean Startup came out. In fact, I think you came and spoke at our office way before the book was published.
Yeah, that must have been 15 years ago now.
Easily. How was the gravity different with that? So in the case of LTSC, it was the banks.
Yeah.
In the case of Lean Startup, it felt like there was this immediate resistance or pushback less from entrepreneurs, seemed like a lot from VCs. I remember very quickly Ben Horowitz and the A16Z gang jumped on top of it, but I don't think they were alone.
I'll never forget, TechCrunch sponsored, or was it TechCrunch? Somebody sponsored a debate.
I remember this.
Fat Startup and Lean Startup. And Ben Horowitz took the Fat Startup side and Fred Wilson took the Lean Startup side.
That's right, it was Fred. Okay.
And I had never met either of them at that time. I was a total nobody. And I was not invited to participate in this, or I had no knowledge it was going to happen. I knew nothing about it. I found out about it after the fact, after it already happened. And like a month later, sometime later, I got invited to meet Fred Wilson. I met him for the first time, and I was like, hey, thank you for taking the Lean Startup side, but what did you say? He was like, I don't know. It's like, have you read the Lean Startup? Do you know about it? He was like, never heard of it before. I just heard what Ben Horowitz was saying about the Fat Startup. I was like, that's definitely wrong. So I knew I was definitely against that. And I met Ben Horowitz later, and we had it out, and it actually, he and I agree far more than we disagree, which is funny because Lean Startup is not. They were debating. Their debate really was about whether you should raise money or not, and how much you should raise.
Okay.
Which Lean Startup has actually nothing to do with that. It's not that that's not important. It's just that Lean Startup is operating at a higher level of what companies should do.
Yes.
And what was really fascinating to me, it was so interesting that TechCrunch and both sides of this debate are capable of having this event, the whole debate, and nobody read the book. No one had any idea what it was about at all. It didn't matter. And I'll never forget when TechCrunch wrote this article, they were like, the word pivot is so horrifically overused, stop saying pivot, or I think it was pivot. It was some Lean Startup term.
Yeah.
And I was laughing because I was like, they could actually go from totally ignoring this concept to saying it was overhyped and you should stop using it without ever passing through the intervening stage of using it correctly even one time.
Not one time.
It's zero intellectual curiosity about what it was about. So here's one thing I learned though in the Lean Startup process. When I first conceived the idea and started writing about it, this is during the financial crisis, I had no idea it was going to become a phenomenon. I mean, truly, I just thought it was right. I was so dumb about how entrepreneurship should change, what the levers of power of entrepreneurship was, that I was like, oh, who has power in the venture ecosystem? VCs. Convince the VCs convince the founders, which is 100% exactly backwards. Yeah. And everyone who knows when I tell this story starts laughing. Because obviously that's not going to work. So I was so wrong. I went to work at a venture firm.
I remember that's where we met you. You were at KP at the time.
Yeah. I spent 6 months as what they call a venture advisor. And I'll never forget, I was talking to a very cool VC who was like, I get what you're doing here. It seems cool. But why do you give it away for free? I was like, what do you mean? It's like, you'll meet with anybody. And you're writing about it and talking about it. Why don't you pick a VC fund? You're at a VC fund. Why don't you do it for them? Or make your own fund or whatever. Get proprietary advantage out of it by sharing it only with the portfolio companies. That seems like this, what you're doing is madness. And I was just like, I don't even understand what planet you're on. That just seems so wrong to me. First of all, because
suddenly one fund is just going to have this massive advantage where everything is just not getting knocked out of the park.
I find that so
What's going on under there?
But it is a common critique, not just of Lean Startup, but of any teaching in entrepreneurship, is that if you really had an edge, you'd use the edge in this private, more sociopathic way. And I was just like, I don't think that's true, but also it really undervalues how important it is to have common conceptual vocabulary. in our industry. Right? Like being able to talk about these concepts. Even the people that criticize lean startup have to use the concepts and the names of the things in order to criticize it, and therefore they spread the meme. I actually thank them. I appreciate it. Please keep doing as much as possible. That startup was awesome for the spread of lean startup, because ultimately I don't really have a dogma that I want people to obey. I want people to learn to think for themselves, and so I want them to use the scientific method and establish what's true. But you're right. Not only did I have the causality backwards, when founders change their minds, VCs change, because venture is a service industry. And ultimately, this is what founders don't really understand. It's why Atlas Shrugged is still a great book all these years later for all its problems. At the end of the day, the power in financial systems is held by the people that bring new companies to life. Because the current system destroys companies. If you look at the trend of how many public companies there are, what's that? Like, look at that data. I studied it. It's terrible.
Brutal.
It's absolutely brutal. So the system requires a steady stream of fresh meat to stay alive. And luckily, places like Silicon Valley provide it. And so if we chose, founders change their behavior, change their beliefs about what it means to be a founder, what it means to be an investor, what it means to be value added. Those beliefs change. The industry has to change. There's no two ways about it. So solidarity is like a real force, real power that founders have. So I had it totally backwards. But on top of that, yes, you're right that I got a lot of pushback from VCs who didn't understand it, including some who now are like, claim that they were there, you know, they knew it all along and they're big lean startup fans, but at the time were really opposed to it. And even some founders didn't like it. And this is the thing that people, again, the reason I have such confidence in the ability of things to change quickly is I've seen it happen. It was not that long ago. I can remember taking ideas that would become lean startup into startup offices. Now, I was being introduced to them often by their VC, which I thought would give me extra credibility, but for those founders who know.
Like, you're a mole, what are you doing here?
It's like, hi, go back and report. Yeah, exactly. It was actually a really bad setup for a meeting. and it was funny because at the company I was at before Lean Startup, I had this reputation. I was a CTO, and I was like, my engineering team was like supernaturally productive. We got so much done, and we were like so smart, and we just, you know, people thought, people thought I had like the magic pixie dust to make engineers work harder. I would come in, and the VCs would, first, the way this always worked, VC would meet me. They're trying to cultivate me to be a founder in the future, you know, like the Silicon Valley way. And they were very, very flattering, and they'd be like, listen, I heard you have the magic pixie dust. And I'd be like, no, sir, with all respect, it's not me at all. It's just, I have a better system. Here's the ideas, so whatever. And they'd be like, blah, blah, blah. Could you sprinkle some of that magic pixie dust on some of my portfolio companies? Sure. So I go to these meetings set up by the VC. People are already very hostile and suspicious. And I'm like, listen, here's what worked for me. We would ship code to production 50 times a day on average. We would do A/B testing. A/B testing was considered a direct marketing technique at those days. We did pivots. Well, here's what a pivot is. I had not once, but many times that I got yelled at. Like, they'd be like, that can't possibly be true. You're lying to me. Get the fuck out of my office. And like, I'd be ejected from the conference room. And I would be like, you called me. You asked me for
like, we only took the meeting because our VCs said to.
Yeah, you asked me to do this for you as a favor, and now you're mad at me and you don't want to hear what I have to say. Like, next time, don't call. And like the first blog posts I wrote them anonymously. I was so embarrassed about this. And I would like send them to people and be like, look, before we have the meeting, would you read this
Why
first?
was it embarrassing? What was the most embarrassing thing for you? Didn't want to be attached to these ideas? The ideas were so radical?
Everyone I taught, first of all, founders did not blog in those days.
Yeah.
Right, so it's a very different universe. And this is not that long ago. We're talking about 2009. It's not like 1885, right? Like only a few years ago. Founders didn't blog. There were so few startup blogs. And when I started blogging, the 3 most prominent bloggers at that time all contacted me within a month of my starting blogging because they saw my URL in their HTTP referrer logs. Because we all had such low traffic in those days that just linking to somebody's blog, they'd be like, who's this new kid on the block?
Right.
And I was anonymous. Everyone I asked for career advice at that time said, don't do it. Blogging is death sentence. You want to be known as an entrepreneur, not as some like crappy blogger. It was very contrarian at the time. People were angry about it. And I just like, I couldn't really, I guess I was just too stupid to understand why they thought it was bad. I was like, this is self-evidently right to me. Founders are being misled. I didn't ever want to be a public speaker. I'm actually very introverted personally. It takes a lot of energy for me to do public speaking and stuff like that. And I remember the first time I spoke to a really, truly large audience, I was going to throw up. I was really nervous. I was in the bathroom behind the stage in the green room. And I was like, what has my life become? What am I doing here? Like, I wanted to write software.
Like Tony Robbins.
I'm like, what am I doing? I'm like, I wanted to write software for a living, and now here I'm doing this crazy thing. And I was just like, am I being egocentric? And what am I doing? I had a real crisis about it. And then I was like, well, okay, if there's even one founder in the audience who will take this message,
that changes everything when you reframe it.
not have their company be destroyed the way I saw so many companies being destroyed. If I save one founder from that, I'd be like, that was one of the worst things that ever happened to me in my life. Spare one person from that, it's worth all this nonsense.
Because suddenly it's not about you anymore.
100%. Making it not about yourself, that was really important. I was expecting like a handful of people in this, I was in this packed room, like it was overflowed. I was like really super, super nervous. The whole thing was funny. Somebody made a bootleg recording of it that for a long time was the only recording of me talking about Lean Startup that like was being passed around Silicon Valley. Yeah. A bunch of seminal things happened to me because like famous people in the Valley got sent this underground recording and they called Kleiner Perkins up to be like, who is this guy?
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, we leave the room and I'm like, oh, I got to get to my unconference session. And I'm trying to get there. And the hallway that I'm trying to go into is blocked with people. It's crowded and I can't get to the room because they're physically blocked. And I'm sitting there being like, whoever's in that room right now is being such an a-hole. They need to vacate the room so I can get in to do my session. Someone I knew really well is like, hey, what are you doing in line?
They hit you on your razor phone.
They're like, yeah, they were like walking by. They're trying to get to the room. They're like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, oh, I'm waiting for the room because someone's clogged. And he's like, you idiot. These people are here for you. There's no other person in the room. There's none of these sessions are attended by thousands of people cramming into the hallway. They want to hear from. And I was like, why? He's like, well, go ask him.
Were you really why?
I was like, I honestly was like, what is going on? What is happening right now? He was like, well, why don't you go ask him? Like, don't stand here in the hallway with me. You need to be in the room talking to the people. And I went in there. I was like, for months after that, every talk I did, I would sit either before or after I walk into the audience. Like, if there's time beforehand, I would like just sit in the audience and be like, why are you here? Why'd you come to this talk?
Yeah.
What do you want? And I lived through, people say that change is impossible, but I lived it. I actually watched these ideas go from everyone thought they were completely batshit crazy to so conventional wisdom that people needed to be contrarian by opposing them and saying they're overhyped and whatever. It was very fast. And I had studied the theories that had kind of gotten us into the mess, stage gate development and stuff like that we were in opposition to. Yeah. And the whole time this was going on and we're getting successful, I was like, one day we will ride out to the field of battle and these other bad ideas will ride out to meet us and we will have the showdown of all time, the epic battle of agile and lean and this and that versus stage gate and Six Sigma, whatever, and we will show our superiority. And like that day never came. There still are people who think Lean Startup is bad, but we never had a showdown, the battle to end all battles. We just won by default. The old ideas just crumbled in the face of new ideas. The early Lean Startup conferences we used to do were like a religious revival.
I remember.
And then all of a sudden they got super corporate. Not because I became super corporate, because those people started coming to the thing. Yeah. Because it became this thing everyone wanted to know about. And I remember the early OGs would sometimes be like, it's not cool anymore. We want to go back. We want to be the underdog. And we're like, we were like the dog that caught the car. We weren't prepared to win. Nobody actually thought winning was remotely possible. When we started, it seemed like a fool's hope. To me, it's just proved that it's possible. Change is possible. Like, things are not the way they are for any particularly good reason. No super smart person set this up in motion that we have to show obedience to. Like, we're just in a planet spinning around in the middle of nowhere and knocking into each other in this like very random way, and we're doing the best we can. You can be existential and despairing about that if you want, but I think it's really remarkable. Look how far we've come and how stupid we are. How good we've done in spite of our limitations.
So this is the interesting thing.
Surely we could do better.
So there are two things that came to mind. One was Tim's very real, very lived mantra, create more value than you capture, because you didn't turn Lean Startup into this like venture backable, scalable business that you could take public down the road. Was that intentional, or how did you think about the vessel for it? Because I do think there's a real, very real sense of stewarding these ideas that you had that could have gone any number of directions.
Could have gone a lot of different ways. Yeah, I was very worried about it at the beginning. And
why?
I had the advantage.
What do you mean worried about? Like, this is something you stayed up at night? Like, what's the right vehicle?
What do I do? Like, once I got over my shock, I was like, this is going to become a thing. I spent a lot of time talking to people, not just reading old management books, but reading people who'd been through something like before. What happened when consultants started showing up and bad faith actors started showing up, and it became this whole, like, almost mockery of itself. Like, it could become really malign. Obviously, I talked to Six Sigma people about, like, remember the black belts and the red, like, certifications became this whole thing, kind of took over that whole movement. So I was like, we got to be careful about this. And so I did two things that people think are totally contradictory. One is I didn't try to profit from all the good stuff myself. Like, I didn't, at the beginning, it was like, there is now a Lean Startup company that does consulting and stuff like that. And you can, especially bigger companies, hire them, and that's great. I allowed anybody else who wanted to create a consulting company. We did do a Lean Startup conference, but lots of other people created their own conferences. For a long time, there were Lean Startup meetups in basically every city where there are startups in the world. That was not a centralized programmed by me. We didn't license them.
And that was by design.
What's that?
You weren't trying to extract.
I tried to be as open source about it as possible.
Okay.
I wanted the big consulting companies to be able to use Lean Startup and not to make their own fake version of it. But we also trademarked the term Lean Startup.
Oh,
I own that trademark
I didn't realize
in
that.
most countries in the world. Like anyone who wanted a license for it, who was willing to give us editorial oversight over how they used it, could basically get it for free or very inexpensive. Was very liberal with it, much more so than people thought was appropriate. But I was like, the only reason to have this is that when the scammers eventually show up, I'm going to threaten to sue them into oblivion. And I can remember it happened. As soon as I started giving workshops, I remember people used to just take my workshop description, copy paste it onto an Eventbrite, and make their own workshop. All these weird bastardized things, and people had their own websites and their own this and that. And I was like, I hired a very fancy law firm. I'm like, I'm going to nuke these people from orbit. And the reason I did that is I heard from people who've been through these previous movements that if you don't do that, that's what it means to be a steward of a set of ideas.
Yeah.
You have to defend the community as well as boosting it. And it took like 6 months to a year before all that activity just stopped. And I realized it's basically like the people.
But it was whack-a-mole during that time.
I was like, this is going to go on forever. But I think what happens is like word got out that like the community down the street's an easy mark. You don't mess with these guys. They're litigious as hell. And so it was like if you put the thing on their car, like the parable of the bear, right? I don't have to run faster than the bear. I just have to run faster than you.
Exactly.
That's all we did. I don't think I've even made the most money from Lean Startup of anybody. I think there's people who've made more money than I have. And again, I don't mind. And I think that's a lot Tim's early influence. You know, I should get the credit for create more value than you capture. Because I really thought that it just seemed right to me.
It was an amazing mantra. It's one I watched him live incredibly close up, but it was also the birth of, my career as an investor.
Totally.
OATV was largely created because here was this ecosystem that was generating so much value, and Tim's like, and I get to sell them books.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And so, it created, obviously a life-changing and career-changing experience for me. Appears that you have done a bit of the same. I mean, it's turned into a lot of advisory opportunities. It's turned into a lot of things. Probably investment opportunities.
It's incredible. I actually have a colleague who did an analysis of all my investing over the years, which I never bothered to do. To me, it was a form of giving back.
Right.
And I viewed it as like almost like a donation. Most investments go to zero anyway, so I just pre-wrote them down to zero in my mind when I made them, and I'm never upset with what happens.
Exactly.
Anything good happens, I'm surprised. It's great. And he was like, do you realize you're making really exceptional returns from these investments? And I was like, no. He's like, oh yeah, here's your DPI and here's your TV. And I was like, I don't.
What are these?
I was like, that doesn't. I was like that. Listen, I have tremendous respect for investors,
right?
And I've learned to do it. Professionally, obviously, because I have to do this stuff, but it wasn't my motivation was really just to support founders. And he's like, not only that, you have great investment returns from the funds that you've been an LP in. And I was like, I was as surprised as anybody. And he was like, we should like make a program out of it. We built a fund of funds to back emerging managers out of it called First Momentum, and it's been really great. But like to me, it wasn't about the data. The data only ratified that this was right, and I was just like, look, I want to find people that support founders and who love them. And they love them back. Yeah. Because I think like ultimately that's the basis of this whole ecosystem. And I felt a little silly at the time. Like I was like, I'm supposed to be the mentor in this situation now. I'm supposed to be saying something serious. Shouldn't I be telling him about TVPI and whatever? But I was like, I don't believe in that stuff. Not that I don't think it's important to get returns, but that's not where the returns come from. People have confused the exhaust for the engine. Engine comes from finding and backing and really supporting, like truly supporting. And so we're doing this program now. We back a lot of VCs through it. We have LPs and we've made great returns for them, and we're very happy with it. But we did an analysis of what are the attributes that correlate with returns the most. By far, the most useful signal is whether when we call founders for a reference on that person, the founders love them. In retrospect, I was like, well, what else could it be?
Right.
But it's funny that we went through this very analytical journey to get to this very obvious truth. And he was speaking about it at a conference. Several GPs and several LPs came up to him afterwards to scold him about this. Like, you can't make your strategy has to be serious, and founders need oversight, and they need
Right.
And then a really successful founder came up to him afterwards, like in tears, and was like, thank you for saying, like, and he told them all these stories about all the value he's created for all these investors who've treated him like shit over the years.
Oh, that's so
and it's just like,
interesting.
I think there's this like really dark underbelly of this whole thing, which is like the people who are actually making all this money for all these other people are doing it in spite of the system, not because of it. And when you offer them even the slightest feeling of being seen and encouraged and supported, they could do so much more. So I actually think as successful as this ecosystem has been, we're holding it back with these archaic practices. We could do so much better.
So this is something else I wanted to hit on. I'm so glad you brought it up, which is it's been studied. We have so many examples, so many counterexamples. Why don't you think we're seeing more breakout companies.
In general?
In general. Yeah, in general. Like I saw something the other day. Somebody ran the analysis of like $5 billion, like fund returning companies.
Oh yeah, well, there should be more of them. Yeah.
And I mean, when I came into the business, the conventional wisdom was like 10 to 12 companies a year matter.
Yeah.
And this person kind of plotted out the $5+ billion outcomes that would be considered fund returners across the last kind of 10 years.
Yeah.
It's anemic.
It's bad. Yeah.
It's bad.
It's really bad. And it's again, like the ones that work are so profitable, they can carry so much badness. But
Totally.
Like, that's not an endorsement of the badness.
Well, look, that was Andreessen's whole story when they started. It was like 10 companies a year matter. We're going to get in all 10. We're good.
A root cause of this phenomenon is the formula that institutional investors use to allocate money to VC. Look at all capital flows in the world. There's basically two gigantic pools of capital. There's like the base of the pyramid, endowments, family offices, sovereign wealth funds. That's like $10 trillion, I think. And then there's like $10 trillion in banks. Basically like two co-equal branches of the financial system. The money that is invested from institutional actors is invested according to a formula. This amount, they're seeking alpha. So this amount in stocks, this amount in bonds, these kinds of alternatives. And as the Yale model and these other endowment models have like grown in popularity, that includes all these alternative asset classes, private equity, and venture is one of the. We're actually a tiny little sliver of this
rounding
massive
error for the most
flow,
part.
but a very important one. If you look at the formula, in order to get alpha, optimal returns for your whole portfolio, you really need these highly illiquid, highly asymmetric, returning asset classes.
Yeah.
And so a certain percentage of your assets need to be invested in the asset class. I just pulled a magic trick. Nobody noticed that the term of how much money to be invested in the asset class is a function only of the size of the asset pool, not a function of the size of the number of good investment opportunities available. So what happened was, over the last 20 years, we have taken a larger and larger and larger fraction of this $10 trillion and put it into venture capital, to put it into startups, without making the commitment to increase the number of startups to invest in.
Right.
So what happens in Econ 101, if you have way more money chasing after way fewer opportunities, you see price inflation and returns erode. What is the solution? It's actually very obvious. We need more entrepreneurs. Now, some people say we already got all the ones that we could have because we've already maximized all the graduates of Stanford and Berkeley. We've maximized all the guys who look just like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and there's just...
We got them all.
We got them all. We got them all. So there's no more, so inflation is inevitable. But that's so ridiculous. Right. I can't believe people can say that out loud because obviously talent is normally distributed and opportunity isn't. So there's this incredible mismatch between the amount of money that needs, like our society actually needs this amount of money to be invested in startups. And we don't have enough good ones. So to me, that just seems like the obvious solution is to have a massive expansion of the opportunity for entrepreneurship. So find the extraordinary people wherever they are in the world and make sure that they get backed.
So why aren't there more extraordinary founders given that the lean startup methodology is out there, all these years of research are out there, all these patterns to match against are out there, playbooks to run. Let's assume we can grow the pool.
I mean, the lack of returns is a problem because the denominator's grown so much. So we're not keeping, there are definitely more entrepreneurs operating today than at any time in history, and definitely more successful ones. And probably even by whatever threshold you want, the gross amount is good. I think we made tremendous progress there. The problem is that we have vastly, vastly, vastly more capital that needs to be invested than we can keep up with. So I actually think that it's just a human development, it's a talent issue. And it's not that the talent doesn't exist, it's that most people still, I travel the world still talking to people about entrepreneurship. Most people do not see entrepreneurship as a valid career opportunity for themselves. They don't see themselves as like the kind of thing that they could do. And then you have like tons of people that just their personal circumstances do not allow them to take risks. I want to talk about the origins of indie VC. Because I can remember when that was a crazy idea.
It's still a crazy, less crazy.
Less crazy now. Yeah. I think it's been demonstrated. I have a very vivid memory of you coming to meet with me in Soma in San Francisco. I remember what that restaurant was. I think we went to a cool restaurant or something. Yeah. And we were talking about, you were pitching me the idea, and we were talking about like how at a time when it was seen, the question was not even like, is it a good idea, but more like, how could it even be structured? Yeah. Like, how would the investment instrument look like? And so you've been through this too.
Yeah. Multiple times, funny enough, because when we started OATV, we had the same kind of resistance. right? There was a clear opportunity to Tim and I and Mark that there was a different kind of investing that was taking shape, a different kind of company that was taking shape, but we didn't really have a name for what that looked like. I can't remember what was in our first deck, but it certainly wasn't seed.
Yeah.
And so, it took us almost 2 years to raise that. And it's funny you talking about stewardship, because I remember the whole time we were raising it, and we were hearing no, but we were also getting like really positive signals. I remember looking at Tim and Mark and saying like, this wants to happen. We just need to get out of the way. We'll prune we'll do everything we can, but this thing is going to happen with or without us. And so we should, for me at least, there was a very real sense of stewardship. And with Indy, you caught me probably in the like 2 years preceding even announcing or going public with any of it. I mean, I wrestled with those ideas for so long. Part of what I was seeing, and you touched on multiple times today, which was I just saw so many entrepreneurs making unnecessary trade-offs to kind of fit inside these boxes that investors needed them to fit in to attract the capital.
Yeah.
And then you looked at the people who didn't. You looked at this kind of wave of kind of venture scale but bootstrap businesses, and they were just wild. Cultures, founders, like it felt like this missing piece of the overall startup puzzle that we'd somehow just kind of swept under the rug in the race to like appeal to these patterns that VCs were matching against.
Yeah.
And that just felt like it was selling entrepreneurship short. And one of my post-Indy launches, I remember using a term that was like the startup industrial complex. And, this idea, you used deboning, which I loved, like this idea that you kind of strip away, you kind of factory farm these things that there's no life in them. There's no soul in them.
The nutritional value has been stripped away.
And so here's these founders that are trying to commit themselves to something that they should care deeply about. And oftentimes what they end up doing is kind of contorting themselves into something that looks like it needs to look, that needs to present the way it needs to present, to attract the resources it needs to attract. I mean, the interesting thing though is the resources are actually probably not the big unlock. Like, to your point, there's so much money chasing so many ideas. Or actually, they're not chasing so many ideas. What they are is so much money chasing the same ideas.
Same ideas, yeah. Well, and all being invested by contrarians, don't you know?
But no, I mean that was the journey of India. The journey of India was probably like 3 years of private conversation. Because I remember that conversation. Then I remember we had a phone call, and I remember exactly where I was sitting when we had it, and we had talked about like, what did we call it? You had a term that was so good. It was like a line of equity.
Yeah.
I
remember that. Absolutely. Absolutely. The line of equity.
With the idea that we would commit a certain amount up front and they could draw it down as needed. I mean, these were all the like formative ideas around Indy, with the whole, foundation being, even the idea behind, the redeemable equity and the lines of equity and all that stuff was like, give founders more control.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think some of it worked. I think a lot of it, look, the world we launched into in 2015, 2016 was right about to rip.
Yeah, that's true. The timing was really interesting.
Timing was really rough. And so for, the 5 or 6 years, we, kind of felt that gravity. It was a constant refrain from my friends was like, you just need a good downturn.
Good downturn, that'll help. Yeah, exactly. Never let a crisis go to waste.
Exactly. And then we had the crisis, and we were out. Like, we couldn't raise any money for it.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's when I kind of wandered for like 1.5 years, 2 years, and again kind of felt that stewardship again of like, man, these ideas are real. And now we have this interesting data where we've had free money, unlimited access to money for a certain segment of founders, and it hasn't moved the needle.
Right.
It actually didn't change anything. In fact, in many ways, it probably distorted and made it worse.
Oh, sure. Raising too much money is just as bad as raising too little.
Right.
And people always think, how can that possibly be true? But I'm like, think of it as calories. Like, I think we understand that pretty well. And again, like if you really take seriously the idea that companies exist to enrich their shareholders, then like investors become the primary actors in the story of entrepreneurship, and that just like we have this natural thing to be like whatever they want, and they like raise as much money as possible to return as much possible, and it just like that idea is really toxic, and it's just
So it's funny you used a phrase that I loved. I can't remember where I heard you say it, but it's not unique to you, but it was in the context of this, and it just got me thinking about, to something as fragile as a startup and idea, to put fundraising at the front.
Oh yeah, sure.
And so the idea, the message, it was shareholder primacy theory.
Yeah.
So what is shareholder primacy theory, and how do you think that factors into any of this we're talking about?
This is over the last like 40 or 50 years, there's been this concerted effort to change people's perception of what capitalism is all about. The idea is that the purpose of a corporation is to enrich shareholders. Like that's what it's for. And like Milton Friedman would very famously say stuff like, if a company's going to do good works in the world, don't do good works, just give the money back to your shareholder and let them do the good works, right? Like why should you get to decide? And it's kind of like, there's always been this kind of principal agent problem with investing, which is like, who has the control over the company? Does managers have it? They use it for their own enrichment, or should investors have it? And so we've kind of like imbibed this morality, really. It says that like, because investors provide the funding necessary for companies to exist, and companies couldn't exist without it, then they should have the final say as to what, ultimately what happens to companies. And that doesn't really make sense. And it's not based on anything. Like, it's just an assertion that that's how it should be. Because I could say the exact same thing is true, like, it's true for customers too. If there were no customers, there would be no company either. Should customers have the final say? If there were no employees, there'd be no company either. Should employees have the final say? Like, what is special about investors, and especially secondary investors?
Right.
I actually don't mind the theory so much when we're talking about people who make seed investments, people who actually give money to a company that it uses to make a thing that couldn't have been made without that money. Whether that means that for the rest of their life, the company is forever indebted to that investor to do whatever they want.
Right.
I don't know. But the vast majority of investors are not investing to make anything happen. They're secondary investors. They have bought a share from someone who bought a share, who bought a share from someone who bought a share, who bought a share from someone who bought a share, who bought a share from someone who bought a share from the guy who gave the money to Coca-Cola company or whatever company to cause it. It's like we might be 25,000 hands removed from the person who actually did the primary investing. So I feel like the moral theory of shareholder primacy is kind of dubious, but we don't have something good to replace it either. Like people, there was this whole multi-stakeholder capitalism thing for a while there. Chesky and I used to joke about them as fake holders, because and they were criticized, I think very rightly, for being like, oh, no shareholder primacy means no accountability. Well, who wouldn't want that? It's like managers do whatever they want, and you can't say boo about it, And there was a great study, because there was that famous Business Roundtable letter about multi-stakeholder capitalism and the end of shareholder primacy right before COVID. So some enterprising academic looked at how people who signed the letter versus didn't sign the letter, how they responded to treating their employees and customers in COVID, and found that the people who signed the letter were on average worse than the people who had claimed to just be about making money for investors. So I think we have to find something that is the problem with kind of this the anti-shareholder or anti-accountability is we're not actually for anything, we're against something else.
Yeah.
And to me, the antidote to this is to start remembering an old lesson. So many things we take for granted as our the basics of our world today are very recent innovations. Stock buybacks used to be illegal until the mid-'80s, I think. In living memory, they were considered a crime, and now everyone's like, well, obviously managers are going to do buybacks to enrich themselves, duh. Quarterly guidance is a relatively new innovation, not really that good.
Yeah.
I mean, even quarterly reporting is not even 100 years old. So it's we've treated these things oh my God, they're pillars upon which things are based, but a lot of them are just recent, not very good innovations. And I always think about this in relation to our grandparents who went through horrible times and had to build this apparatus of a society out of tragedy, and being we're going to learn these lessons and make sure that they never happen again, and we're going to pass them on to our children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
And I feel for a while now, we've been basically hacking up the foundations of this beautiful house and using them for firewood. And every time we take a wall out, we're like, nothing bad happened. House didn't collapse. I guess it's fine. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. And I was thinking about firewood. I had it on my mind because I was meeting with a guy who runs one of the world's largest insurance companies. And they, because they're an insurance company, they have to invest a lot of money for very long time horizons, because they don't just need returns in an abstract sense, but they have to be able to meet the claims in the future. So they're very long-term investors. It's like, we don't have any money in the stock market. We don't believe in the stock market. We have a little money there. We just like don't think anyone there is long-term. I was like, what do you want to invest in? What do you invest in? He's like, we invest in forests, forestry companies, forest making. I was like really having a hard time. He's like, no, we buy actual agricultural land and we farm it. And I was like, why do you do that? It's like, we need something that will produce consistent and predictable returns over very long term. Of course, we do other stuff too, but we do a lot of this. And he was like, the problem with the public markets today is that you take any one of our forests and say, I need you to increase quarterly profits. It's really easy. Just cut the trees down. Yeah. I can make the quarterly returns on a piece of land be whatever you want for as long as you want, until one day I can't do it anymore. And he's like, my view of public companies is they are cutting down the trees for firewood to boost their earnings, and nobody cares. And he's like, why would I want my money in that system? That's crazy. So this idea that like companies are stewards of resources, that they have a spirit and purpose that is beyond making money, is ironically the way to make money for your shareholders. It's actually more profitable to run your company that way. And then, people say, well, what about accountability? What about this? Like, we have to solve, those are all problems to be solved. But like I said, every one of these problems is a well-known solution. You just have to be willing to do it.
Why does that get stamped out of founders so early?
Now, you've asked a really good question. Don't interview me. Go interview some founders. Ask them when did
in your conversations?
I see it all the time. Every round, I tell founders, the thing, you should make sure you become a public benefit corporation, establish a mission trust, make sure you're, like, a big problem is independent board members. So most companies are, half insiders, half investors, and then some number of independent board members. And the problem is, like, how do you become an independent board member? Is it because founders create lots and lots of companies and they refer you from one company to another? No, you get to become an independent board member because investors recommend you for the job. So if you have two investors and an independent and two insiders, you basically have three investors. And so like, you've already lost control of your company, right? So like, that's no good. But you can't say, well, we're never going to have any independent board members. The long-term benefit trust we set up in Anthropic is like the correct solution to this problem, where the independent directors are accountable to an entity that has trustees, that has some purpose, that is not, they're not investors, but they have a different relationship. In the same way that GPs who are on your board are also accountable to their LPs and to their fiduciary duty to their company. They always have a split loyalty. Well, there's no problem. No problem for investors. It's no problem for the independent directors. Yeah. So like, okay, so you don't, but you're like, it's too complicated. You don't do it. So you don't become a public benefit corp. You don't do that. You rely on your success to maintain your leverage, to just go. And some people have been able to maintain that forever. There's people who run public companies today, but they still have complete control and everything's worked out great and they're super happy. Some of those companies have turned malign, but not for their lack of control. And some of them just quit and go off and live their life, know, and they just leave a negative legacy behind. And I think part of why they're going mad is they know how they're going to be remembered in history, the way we remember the robber barons of the 1920s. So what was it for again? But anyway, so you don't put those protections in place. So then you go to raise a fundraising round and VCs are like, we believe in you. So whatever you want to do, we're just minority owners here. You're in charge. And they're like, oh, great. Perfect. And then the moment comes when it's like, we have to make a decision about whether to, like a classic thing is tech companies often have like non-employee stakeholders who do work on the platform, Uber drivers or whatever. Yeah. Treat them well or race to the bottom. And you go to your investors and you're like, I'm going to treat them well. And they're like, I don't know. Investors might not like it. And you want to say, F you. I don't have to care what investors think, but like, you're burning all this money and you start to realize, wait a second, if I try to raise money,
I'm going because I'm on this treadmill now.
Yeah, and like the worst part is investors have veto rights often over fundraising transactions. It's a common thing in investor rights agreements, although please, founders, don't put those in your agreements. They don't have to. People forget that even if your investor means well, when you take an investment from an investment management company, you are not taking an investment from an individual person. You are taking it from a corporation that can change. So I'll tell you a story. This was during the last downturn. Company I had helped raise money, really ambitious founders, really awesome company doing some really out there technology. Very difficult to raise the first couple rounds for this company. I worked really hard on it. People did not get it, did not believe, but they got it done. And there was a specialty venture firm that were so good. Like I became an LP in this firm. They were so good. I was like the way that they treated this company, and they led 3 consecutive rounds in this company. They were just like, it was like so glad that they were in such good hands. And there was a civil war at the firm one day. I never really got the backstory, but half the partners left. The other half remained. And so the partner who had been working with this company disappears. He's not in his personal board seat. He's in the board seat of this firm. He doesn't work at that firm anymore. They appoint a new person to that seat. The company now, it's a downturn, so it's like a really hard time to make money. We're like really in a like crisis moment of like, will the company survive or not? And they're like, look, we need your help to raise this money. Like, first of all, you lead this round. And he's like, no. They're like, okay, well, will you at least help us raise this round? No. Okay. Will you at least not exercise your veto rights to prevent us from raising this round? He's like, what's in it for me? They're like, what's in it for you is we're one of your largest portfolio companies and we're going to be successful. He's like, yeah, but you're going to do that anyway. What's in it for me? And they called me in a panic, like, what do we do? And I was like, well, remember we had that conversation about governance? Did you do any of that stuff? No. Our lawyer told us it was too early. We could always do it later.
Wow.
Like, well, guess what? Now you have to give him something.
Now it's later.
Now it's later, and it's too late, and you have to give him something. And it was horrible. I mean, we got it done, but it was absolutely awful. And it was so unnecessary. He had leverage, so he used it. And now in this case, it was fine, because he was so crass about it. It was easy for them to be like, wow. But most investors are a lot more subtle than that. I think they're not even aware of it themselves, the way in which they make these things subtly worse. Because again, they're being influenced by this gravity. They want to look good in front of their LPs. They want to look good in they don't want to be embarrassed in front of the other GPs. And if you do something that's too founder friendly, people start to look at you funny and what's going on? So like, it doesn't have to be that way. It's just like this incredibly unnecessary friction that is slowing companies down. What I really appreciate about the Indie VC story, now coming back around to what you were saying, is not so much that there's only one way and the indie VC way is better than the other VC way. Like obviously there's many different kinds of companies, and I've gotten to know many of the indie style companies, and I think it's super cool. But I appreciate your persistence in just articulating and then creating the space for a different path for companies to follow. And that's what capitalism should be good at. Competition. 1,000 flowers bloom. Let many, many different paths be attempted, and we'll see in the end what's really worthwhile. And I just think the difficulty that you had to go through, first the conceptual difficulty, and then obviously the difficulty raising the money and the pushback and all this stuff. I mean, I honor you for having pushed through that to get to the other side, when now like this category of companies has a name and has a path and has like a sense of community and purpose that maybe it wouldn't have had otherwise.
I appreciate that.
So thank you for doing it. And don't forget that so many of these overnight successes, I'm sure you've heard of the Indie VC is a big overnight success, but it took how many, 6 years? People say Lean Startup was an overnight success. I worked on it for a long time without anybody having any clue what I was doing. All these overnight successes are many years in the making. That's how it goes. So people forget that like the key part of the hockey stick shape is the long flat part. You gotta, very few people get to skip that whole thing, and the ones who do, it messes up their life forever. We should encourage people like just to build a company you think is amazing, you think is great, and maybe it'll be bootstrap, maybe it will be the next big thing, maybe it'll be venture back, maybe you'll go out of business, and maybe the thing that you proved was possible, other people will feast on the carcass of your failure and ultimately realize your dream. Will you sleep okay at night?
Well, what I love about your story...
Someone is buzzing me. Let me just see.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if I'm supposed to be doing something right now.
Yeah, because we're like 3 hours in. I will show you the notes I had going. We literally talked about like 2 things.
Okay, but I have to go in 5 minutes.
I know you need to go. All I was going to say for you...
We can do part 2 sometime.
I would love that, seriously.
Okay.
What I was going to say specific to you was so many people have that same feeling and ambition, but they feel like they have to start big. They've got to like take a big swing. And all I would say to anyone who's wrestling with that is Eric Ries started all of this with anonymous blog posts.
Yes, that's true. It is true.
Publishing for free on the internet and putting ideas out there.
That's funny you put it that way. You don't know how big the swing is before you take it. So if people are like, I gotta find the big swing. You don't know. You might be taking a big swing right now. This could be the start of your media empire. Or this could be a funny video you make one time. You don't know. Nobody knows. Now, what I do think is important, and I do think sometimes people hear that and say, well, therefore, I don't need to have any kind of ambition or vision or long-term plan. And that's like, it's different to say, you don't know what's going to happen. That doesn't mean you can't be trying to accomplish something worthy. And like, if you'd have talked to me in the early days of Lean Startup, I couldn't have foreseen how it turned out. I could not have foreseen all the success and getting to travel the world, all this. That was all impossible for me to imagine. But I did have this idea like I really believed that I was right about an idea that I thought was really important.
Yeah.
And I didn't have the courage to go big with it. So I did what I could do, and one thing led to another, as you say.
It's incredible. This is awesome. Yes.
So good.
Round 2.
Always a pleasure to see you.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, happy to do it again.
Dude, this is so fun.